Hello, outlets, and welcome to another episode of Shameless Plugs. We are excited about this one. Yay! Because
Very
it's
excited.
The Halloween 2018 episode. If you have listened to our show in the past, you know that we both love Halloween. We love everything about it. We love the season. We love the holiday. We love everything there is to love about Halloween. So, yay! Halloween!
Yeah, Halloween! 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 Sorry.
Samantha's doing her Halloween dance here.
I'll stop.
Yeah.
I'll be done with that right now. Moving on.
Yes, so we're going to get right to it this episode, guys and gals. So we're doing 3 stories for you today. Three scary stories.
Happy Halloween stories.
Happy Halloween, yes. So there will be one from Samantha, one from me, and one from our guest for this episode, Shameless Storytime, Mark Dubovec.
Yep.
So with that, let's get to it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to kick off our stories, and this has been an interesting challenge for me because I tend to not focus on the horror or scary things very often. So in doing research on what horror was, because research is good, I found some interesting perspectives on what makes up the genre of horror, and one of those I found is taking real-life things that you're afraid of and writing them down. And so that is kind of where this story comes from. It's something that would be terrifying to me if it were to happen, and I hope that you enjoy my first dive into this very new and scary world. So, my story is called Cursed. Before my wife was my wife, she told me she was cursed. I remembered teasing her, and I remember her serious blue eyes as they watched me find humor in her ridiculous proclamation. Then her soft lips stretched into a small, sad smile. That was the first time. 2 years into our marriage, we discussed children, and she mentioned the curse again. I never thought I'd have children, she said. But you think you want them now, I said. I wanted children. My family is cursed, she said. I decided I'd break the curse, but it meant I couldn't have children. You're not cursed. I never explained it to you, she said. I'm only asking because I know you'll be melancholy the rest of the night, I said, and she cracked a small smile. How would not having kids break your curse? She tilted her head to the table and picked at her fingernails and then stared at me. Her blue eyes were so serious that I had to look away. My dad died, she said. I nodded. Her father passed before we met. Cancer, she said. My mother had 2 daughters, and she was the oldest daughter of her mother. My grandfather died. Cancer. My grandmother had 2 daughters, and she was the oldest daughter of her mother. My great-grandfather died. Cancer. My great-grandmother had 2 daughters, and she was the oldest daughter of her mother. I am the oldest daughter of my mother. It has to be me. It's a strange coincidence, I said. An eldest daughter has not had a son in over 100 years. We are cursed. I put my hand over hers and kissed her across the table. I'm afraid it'll happen to you, she said. We'll start with 1, I said. It has to be only 1. Unless it's a boy. And if we have 2 accidentally, and they're both girls, we have to have a 3rd. Okay, I said. Promise. We'll have 1 or 3. I promise, I said. She nodded, just once. I unlock my car and sit behind the wheel. I put my foot on the brake and press the button. It's on, but quiet. The hybrids are like that. I pull out of the parking garage and onto the road. Call Clarice, I say. The car rings. She answers. You're calling early, she says. I'm between appointments. Should still be home on time. How's your day been, she asks. Packed, I say. That's good. The line goes quiet. I sit at a red light and my blinker ticks. Girls just got home from school. Claire says she needs help with her math homework. Molly wants pizza for dinner. We should have pizza, I say. We need to go shopping, she says. But pizza's fine for tonight. I turn left and merge onto the highway. How was your day, I ask. Good. Busy. I finished the sketches for the Eye Institute and sent them over. We'll see what complaints they have now. Got a call from a professor at the university. They need a couple skeletal drawings for a journal. Told them to send me the specs. I change lanes and hear Clarice's voice get further from the phone. Yes, Dad said we can order pizza. She's back. You caused a dance party in my kitchen, she says. I grin. Neither of the girls can dance, so it's mostly spinning and arm waving. I can picture them. That's what dads do, I say. Where's your appointment? Near Elm. There's an office there interested in our new catheter. I'm just doing a quick presentation, then I'll be home. Call me when you leave and I'll order food. Okay, I say. Love you. Love you, she says, and I hear the same in the background. She hangs up. I see my exit and change lanes. Claire, our oldest, is her mother from her blue eyes to her size 9 feet. She's reserved and thoughtful and thinks logically, mostly. Molly, our youngest, is a wild heart. She has my brown eyes and crook smile and experiences the world with every sinew in her compact body. Neither can dance, but neither can Clarice or I. Right on Broadway, right on Peppermill, left on Elm. I turn into an alley and park behind a brown brick building. It is 2 stories tall with big windows covered by plastic blinds. A woman in a gray t-shirt with a big pink ribbon on it sits on the bench left of the sliding glass doors. Clarice told me she was cursed. She told me twice, and my youthful mind believed I was indestructible. Even if we did have 2 daughters, curses aren't real. I open my door. I wonder if Claire will be strong enough to resist. I wonder if she'll meet a guy like me, who she warns and then eventually falls for because she's so in love. I wonder if I'll live that long. This oncologist is one of the best in the city. If I fight hard enough, maybe I'll break the curse. I'm not even sure what I've got yet. That's why I lied to my wife. After I know, I'll tell her. Tonight, maybe. After we make love and are lying in bed, I'll tell her, and I'll beg her to teach Claire about this. Because maybe Clarice is right. Maybe there's only one way to fix this. I close the car door and take a deep breath. Or maybe I'll just tell Clarice to let things happen. Is it cruel to wish loneliness on your child or immense heartbreak? I don't know. It's a terrible curse.
That's a gut punch. That's a gut punch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's horror from real life. So yeah, that is the end of my story called Cursed. I'm sorry for anyone I made uncomfortable or cry, but that is where the horror took me.
Understood.
So
when we get to mine, it will be very different than that.
But I think after my story, we're having our guest next,
We
right?
are going to have our guest next, yes.
Yeah, so we will bring Mark on.
Yes.
Hello, this is Mark Dubovec, and I am appearing on Shameless Plugs to read my vampire story, Nosferatu Blues. I wrote this a few years ago, and basically the idea for it was, how would Dracula react to watching Twilight? So, here it is, Nosferatu Blues. The solitary creature slinked into line at the theater, only glancing at the title on the marquee, something like Eternal Echoes. Night just began, and he figured this would be a warm place to spend a couple of hours before grabbing someone to eat and finding a place to hunker down in before sunrise. When he reached the box office, he dug through the 1,000 pockets of his long, dirty brown coat, ignoring the look of disgust on the clerk's face as he dropped the last of his wrinkled green bills and grimy coins in the little metal dish under the plastic barrier. He held up one finger and then scratched his scalp with a long yellow nail. The employee, a young girl with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, perfectly exposing her long white throat, said nothing. She ripped a stubby ticket from the printer and slid it under the plastic. He reached under, sliding his clammy hand briefly along her fingers before she yanked them back. Theater 3, she said, looking past him at the teenage couple behind him. He smiled, his mouth and teeth hidden beneath a long, greasy beard. Years ago, he'd have been able to get this girl, any girl, to obey him with just a look. When he started out this lifestyle, he needed to speak and project his thoughts. But at his peak, all it took was that look. A piercing stare into the eyes, a gaze into the soul, and they were his. His to do what he needed, what he wanted. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the girl wipe her hands with a moist towelette. He sighed. It had been a long time since he'd been able to do that. What happened? How had he come to this? He blamed modern technology. It used to be easy for him to go from town to town, village to village, and plunder and devour as he wanted. But first came photography, then film and video and DNA collection. Record-keeping became better, and the lifespans of humans, thanks to their scientists and doctors finally realizing how superstitions were holding them back for centuries, grew longer, and it became harder to vanish when times became difficult. The worst of it was losing his fortune. All the gold, all the riches, the priceless artifacts he had collected over a millennium, gone. Not all at once, to be sure, but a tomb in Egypt unearthed here, a mine shaft of artwork in Germany discovered there, and they, the The humans claimed the spoils for themselves. What could he do? It's not like he could produce a claim check and demand it be returned. There was no way to hoard any of his belongings. Banks demanded personal information, photo ID, and a social security number. He couldn't even remember his birthday. He slunk off toward the theater, ignoring the swarming mass of humanity more excited for the show rushing by. It was a tacky, modern theater lobby. Massive film posters coated the walls, advertising all the latest releases, making the actors on them look like shiny giants ready to squash the people looking up at them. The carpet was an ugly sheet of orange and black fuzz, stained by the spills of 1,000 soft drinks and tubs of popcorn, which to him tasted like salted paper. The Globe, before it burned down, was a theater, the cultural watering hole of royalty and nobility, and he lorded among them. He sat in the upper chamber, looking down on the plays and the unwashed rabble standing beneath the stage, as if they were there for any other reason than the sword fights and dirty puns. He rubbed his eyes as at the first touch of a headache appeared. The red and blue neon lights burned his visions. Little humans ran around screaming unattended, and worst of all, the laboratories were inside the building. He could never fathom why humans wanted waste to be disposed of in a room next to where they ate or slept. True, bathrooms proved a good place to stage an occasional ambush, be on some fat middle-aged drunk sitting on a toilet, but in the old days he could snatch someone on their way to or from the necessary and take them away under the cover of darkness before anyone in the house realized they were gone. It just felt so undignified that he, of all creatures, a vampire, must eat in a bathroom next to an unflushed toilet. After all these years, he still didn't know what was worse, the smell of their stool and urine, or that nasty lemon-scented air freshener they sprayed on everything. The vampire entered the screening room. It was already blackened, lit by the flickering images projected across the screen, highlighting the bits of dust dancing and bobbing through the air. He shuffled sideways over protruding thighs and knees to an open seat somewhere in the middle of the back row, feeling his sneakers stick a couple of times to the floor along the way and hoping it was only dried Coca-Cola syrup. He climbed over one last leg of some boy, stepping on his foot as he did so. "Hey, watch it, freak!" The vampire said nothing in reply. He sank on the seat next to the boy, pulling his coat tight around him. The boy turned to the girl sitting next to him. "Can you believe some people?" she asked. The boy glanced back at him, leaned closer to the girl, and whispered something they both laughed at. He ignored them, and that voice in the back of his head telling him to rip their throats out right then and there. The boy looked like an athlete. He wore a thick blue and white high school sports jacket over broad shoulders and arms as thick as tree trunks. The girl, no doubt one of the boy's perks, looked like a cheerleader. Long curly hair and baby doll face, wearing a dress too formal for the occasion. No doubt this was as good as life was going to get for them. The vampire yawned, tucked his knees close to his chest, and fell asleep as soon as he eased his forehead against his arms. He awoke sometime later, not sure where he was. The darkened audience, the stream of light projecting through the air and spreading out into a vast image against a screen the size of a wall, the dancing dust particles, it all came back while the dream of a long-ago castle faded in memory. He groaned. The headache was much worse, and he knew it wasn't just being stuck in this cramped theater. He was hungry and needed to feed soon. Hopefully the movie would end, and he could figure out where to get a snack. "I'm a vampire." The voice emerged as a whisper, but echoed through the theater. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck tingle and looked up at the screen. Two polished, pale humans, probably only a few years older than the teenagers sitting next to him, filled the screen, staring into each other's eyes. Their faces covered the wall. No world existed apart from them. The girl's dark hair blew gently across the bridge of her nose. Water filled the boy's eyes as if he was about to cry. "Where's the vampire?" he asked. A catcall of shushes and shut-ups bombarded his ears, and he slumped in his seat, looking up, his mouth open. Surely this movie wasn't suggesting this boy was. "I don't care, Thomas," the girl on screen said. "I love you, and I will love you forever." Thomas said nothing, but his eyes flashed a rainbow of colors before settling on crystal blue. His mouth open, he pulled the girl closer. This was it, the vampire thought. Okay, he seduced her, lured her away from safety. Now the monster within will emerge and feed. "My dear Katerina," Thomas said, "for accepting me for who I am, I shall love and protect you, always." They embraced, their lips pressed together as a violin played to a crescendo on the soundtrack. All the girls in the audience swooned while their male companions groaned or remained silent and stared down at their cell phones. A few whistles and catcalls rang out. "Show your boobs," a husky voice shouted. Thomas and Katerina parted, the screen showing them standing next to each other as their hands clasped together. The bright orange sun emerged behind them. He took her hand in his. "Your touch is cold," she said. "But my passion for you burns," he said, "as yours does for me." They smiled at each other, turned their backs to the camera, and walked off into the sunrise as the boy's flesh glistened and shined like a peacock's feathers in the sun's gentle golden rays. The screen turned to black as the white credits appeared. The lights of the theater came on, and the audience stood up and began filing out as the movie's credits scrolled by. "What did you think, Ricky?" the girl asked the boy in the blue athletic coat. He shrugged. "It was gay," he said as they shimmied out of the row. The vampire wanted to follow them. He wanted to see them get inside their nice little car, tail them as they drove to an isolated spot for a little necking, and then kill the boy and feed on the girl. That's what he wanted to do. He remained fixed in his seat, staring up at the blank white screen. The insult, the nerve, the misrepresentation. Is this what his kind had been reduced to? He had seen other movies humans had made about his species, and yes, those were filled with inaccuracies and hilarities. Really, a cross and holy water? But they had the decency, the respect to portray vampires as creatures to be feared, creatures who ruled the night and fed on mankind at will, beings whose power far surpassed even the strongest. "Hey, buddy, you mind clearing out?" The vampire jolted out of his seat and stood up. The theater employee carrying a broom and dustpan didn't even look at him as he swept under the seats. "Next show starts in 15 minutes, the employee said. "I'm going to need you to clear out." The vampire turned and faced him, blocking the aisle. The employee stopped in front of him. The tag on the front of his shirt read, "Glenn." "Now look," Glenn said. "I need to clean this place up before the next show. Now would you please leave?" The vampire said nothing. At another time he would have ripped off Glenn's head for such insolence, which in all likelihood would have inspired a mob carrying torches and pitchforks. They'd chase him back to his dark fortress where he'd frighten them off with minimal effort, a misshaped shadow on the stone walls and the howling of wolves. Then he'd claim 2 more the next night as a warning against further resistance. Today, such a display of strength would result in police officers, SWAT teams in body armor with shotguns and machine guns. They'd entomb him in a psychiatric institution or drag him out into the sunlight. And as satisfying as it would be to see the look on Glenn's face as his spine separated from his skull, to hear his voice shriek higher and higher as his vocal cords were stretched, it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. The vampire shuffled out of the row, back into the tacky, neon-lit lobby of the theater, and out into the cool night air. He stood on the sidewalk, looking up in the sky at the pale moon hanging alone among the stars. He strained to hear the squeaking of bats, but heard only the noise of a dirty city. And that was Nosferatu Blues. Thank you for listening. You can always check out my blog, Dubo's Den. It's on Blogspot, so just Google it, dubosden.blogspot.com. And I'm also on Twitter, at DuboDuke. So, again, this is Mark Dubovec, having read Nosferatu Blues, and thank you very much.
All right, so my story is called Come and See. I will warn our listeners before we get into this, there is a little bit of graphic content in this, and there is some sensitive subject matter. So, please, as much as I want our listeners to stick with the show, if you choose to tune out at this point, I understand.
And little ears.
Yes.
Usually our podcast is very kid-friendly.
Yeah,
but
this story is not kid-friendly.
Yeah,
There's some adult language and some adult subject matter in this. So the title again is Come and See. The bug sensation was back again, but Scales didn't bother scratching. Why bother? The itching, that feeling like roaches pricking his skin, it wouldn't be stopped if he dug it himself, no matter how sharp his nails were. Really nothing would stop it short of a full belly. Scratching would just leave him with a bunch of bleeding wounds, and that would just make the hunger even worse. It wasn't just the hunger, he decided. The stares helped. They watched him, thinking maybe he belonged there, but not quite sure. Was he a misunderstood artist, or just a homeless tweaker? A counterculture genius, or a dead-end punk rock degenerate? None of them bothered being discreet, not even the waiters, whose circuits of the room meticulously avoided him. It didn't help that he hadn't had a meal in over a week, and consequently was, at present, not only unable to stop swaying in place to keep his balance, but it also wasted away to what the more avant-garde amongst them would describe as heroin chic, and the more sensible as heroin addict. The ones who had judged him closer to the homeless punk rock degenerate end of the scale were the ones who deserved to win the Cupid dolls, and they weren't wrong. He didn't belong here. So they stared at him, openly, between bites of crackers with imported cheeses that stank like a goat's shit. He stared back, studying them from the corner, sniffing the air and taking them in with it, overhearing their mediocre conversations, each asshole thinking they were the art critic for the New York fucking Times, like the old-timer on the far side of the room, droning on about color choices to his dried-up husk of a wife. The husk wore too much perfume, that sickly sweet flowery crap that old ladies use to execute chemical warfare against church pastors, supermarket produce clerks, and grandchildren, and Scales teetered on the edge of wrenching. Was anything actually worth putting up with this place and these people even any longer? Nope. Scales reached for the handle of the door that would lead to moonlight, music, munchies, and people who weren't pretentious pricks. A hand slightly smaller than the city of Chicago stopped him. If it hadn't been obvious the hand's owner was a bodyguard from the starting linebacker-sized hand, it would have been from the Reservoir Dogs standard issue suit. The bodyguard was super black, too, like Africa and Cole got together and made a baby. "Mr. Nicholas will see you now," bodyguard Zimbabwe said, tilting his head toward a door at the back of the room. His voice was as deep as expected, like having a conversation with an asteroid. The door opened onto a set of stairs that got progressively narrower the deeper they delved, and as the staircase narrowed, the mildew stink in the air got overpowered by something much worse, like they were getting closer to the carcass at the bottom of the Cracker Jacks. The stench would have meant a visit to Gag Reflex Junction. Unintended levity in the middle of this story. Would have meant a visit to Gag Reflex Junction, or perhaps Dry Heaveopolis for any normal person. To someone with Scales' nose, well, if bodyguard Zimbabwe were lucky, he wasn't part of the cleaning crew too. At the bottom, a hallway stretched out before them, lit by flimsy plastic sconces stationed every dozen feet or so. They stabbed at the darkness with butter knives, barely making it flinch. The hallway was an expanse of cool concrete walls and putrid stench, punctuated every so often by a nondescript wooden door that almost blended in with the walls. The door at the end of the hall wasn't like the others, and fit in about as well as Scales had upstairs. Didn't dank gray basements have metal doors warning people away? Weren't they cloaked in graffiti also warning people away? If they were brave enough to be wooden, didn't they at least have enough sense to let their paint chip away to complete the rundown, dangerous motif? This door had the balls to violate expectations. It had the nerve to be deep mahogany with a curved brass handle, polished sufficiently to catch the dim sconce light and somehow manage to glitter in response. The door did, however, fit in perfectly with the den on the other side. Scales' feet practically sank into the burgundy Berber carpet as he crossed the threshold. And speaking of that threshold, the damn thing must have been magic, because the stench didn't dare cross it. The walls were paneled in the same mahogany as the door, and appointed by frosted glass scones that cast the room in light as soft and warm as a blanket fresh out the dryer. In the wall, a fireplace crouched, the old-school kind, as wide as Scales was tall, with a cool granite mantle that stretched past the mouth by a foot on each side. It was big enough he half expected to find gargoyles perched on either corner. The room's literal and figurative centerpiece, however, was a magnificent monstrosity of a desk that matched the mahogany of its surroundings. Topped in glass and a felt blotter with brass edges, this was the kind of desk where contracts got signed, where deals that sealed fates got made. And behind the desk, Mr. Nicholas was entrenched in a presidential chair whose tufted leather was the same shade of burgundy as the carpet. His hair was dark, his eyes equally so. His suit looked expensive and Italian. The damn thing smelled like olive oil. Okay, the olive oil might have been a product of an overactive and over-hungry imagination. Whatever. It was still every bit as Italian as Vinnie Benedetto slurping up a plate of marinara in the middle of the Sistine Chapel. As Scales approached, Mr. Nicholas rose, extending his hand. "Pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Scales." The pair of bodyguards behind him, as big as Zimbabwe but significantly whiter, like albino taking a milk bath white, tracked Scales' movement to make sure he wasn't up to anything. "Just Scales. It's a nickname." Mr. Nicholas gave a patronizing smile. "Yes, I'm aware." The itching increased its intensity as both men sat. So there was some work you needed done? Mr. Nicholas waved off the comment. We'll get to that. Something to drink? There was absolutely zero chance Mr. Nicholas had the vintage Scales craved. He shook his head as one of the vanilla gorillas poured scotch from a crystal decanter. Mr. Nicholas sighed heavily. Straight to business, then. He sipped his scotch, then leaned in, elbows resting on the blocker. I need you to procure a book for me. Go on, Scales replied. He'd expected the job to be something more exotic, considering all the cloak and dagger hoops he'd had to jump through thus far. It's quite rare. The only one in existence, in fact. Let me guess. The book's current owners aren't planning on listing it at auction yet, are they? Mr. Nicholas cocked an eyebrow as a devilish grin split his face. Hardly. I've developed something of a reputation as a, let's call it a collector. My reputation precedes me with the owners. They've taken precautions to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Mr. Nicholas held up a pair of paws so pink and pristine they looked like today was the one day each year they weren't encased in gloves. Scales leaned in, matching Mr. Nicholas. Whatever. Steal a book. Procure, Mr. Nicholas corrected. Yeah, okay, procure. Scales made a show of rolling his eyes and waving his finger around in a la-di-da circle. Like a dude like me gives a fuck. Some book. What's the payoff? Something as rare as this book's probably pretty well protected. What's worth me risking the fiery pit I've damn sure got waiting for me if this goes sideways? He was more brusque than he probably should have been, but he got rude when the hunger got bad. Okay, maybe just ruder. Mr. Nicholas leveled a withering stare. The bodyguard's shadows stretched across the room like demons clawing their way out of the fireplace, reaching for prey. You have a certain reputation as well, Mr. Scales, one that's preceded you into my notice. I'm aware of your appetites? He paused, letting his words sink in. Scales felt the bugs again, along with the familiar clawing at the back of his throat. Acquire the book, and you'll have an endless supply. Scales pushed off the chair's armrest, toppling it in the process. Bullshit. Bullshit. I'm gone. Zimbabwe blocked the exit. He didn't realize the world of hurt he was bringing on himself. Move. Now. Or die. Painfully. Your choice. One side, Delago, Mr. Nicholas said as he strode up alongside Scales. Your threats are unnecessary, tiresome, and pointless. Follow me. He stepped across the threshold into the hallway without waiting for Scales, who, admittedly, was more than a bit flummoxed. Scales called after him. Where are you going? Come and see, Mr. Scales. A show of good faith awaits you. They stopped at the second door on the left. Bodyguard Zimbabwe handed Mr. Nicholas a manila folder so fat it could barely close. On the other side of this, Mr. Nicholas rapped on the door with his knuckles, is Winston Flynn. Mr. Flynn is, by all accounts, a terrible example of humanity. Serial rapist, two-time murderer, and legal loophole exploiter. If there were any justice in the world, men like this wouldn't be in the world. But that's why there are people like you, the cosmic equalizers, Mr. Scales. Mr. Nicholas passed the folder to Scales. All the evidence is there, if you feel the need to verify. Scales read the top page, a police report, and closed the folder 3 sheets in, at the first crime scene photo. Mr. Nicholas flung the door open with all the flair of a ringmaster, and the tangy, pungent aroma of iron greeted Scales. The room possessed the cramped appeal of a broom closet and was only slightly larger. A pudgy man slumped against the wall, unconscious. 3 days of salt and pepper scruff stubbled his chin, more hair than he had left on his head. His breathing was shallow. His right wrist was cuffed to a pipe above his head. His left had been slit. The door clicked shut behind Scales. The change came over him. His pulse slowed. His pupils dilated. His canines pushed through his gums to full puncturing length. From outside, Mr. Scales spoke. Or Mr. Nicholas spoke, damn it. Bon appetit, Mr. Scales. And that's it.
Nice.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. That was my one try at a vampire story, because I've never done one. So I wanted to make a punk rock tweaker vampire.
Yeah,
That just seemed more interesting to me.
Feel like it worked.
Thank
I feel
you.
like it worked. There were some really awesome descriptions in there.
Thank you. And reading it out loud, there were some parts that made me cringe a little, I'm not going to lie, but
Yeah.
I still like it overall.
Oh, yeah, agreed.
So-
I would be happy with it.
Yeah.
Not to go all, shameless plugs on the education front here,
Yes.
but reading your stories out loud is a really great way to, one, get used to reading out loud,
Yes.
because it's a lot harder than it sounds.
Yes.
And two, it's a really great way to hear things that
Yes.
you don't hear in your head when you're writing.
And the thing is, that's an older story that I'm just reading now. I wrote that a long time ago, and I did read it out loud then. But now I think because, I've matured as a writer and everything,
yeah.
I'm hearing things now that didn't bother me back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And now it's like, oh, why did I put that in there?
Where did that come from?
Yeah. It's like, oh my god, I have to edit this before I repost it. So.
Hey, segue.
Yes.
You can find all of our stuff on our respective websites.
Yes.
And then obviously find us on shamelessplugs.com. And we will have Mark's stuff on there as well as links to his pieces and work and all that good stuff. So...
Yes. So thank you for listening, for joining us for another episode. If you're still listening, if my story didn't scare you off.
It was
Well, if they're listening, then my story didn't scare them off.
I was just going to say, I was like, they'd still be here.
Yeah. So hi. Hi, those of you who stayed. Hope you have a great Halloween. Hope you enjoy it as much as we certainly are going to.
Absolutely. And happy Halloween, outlets. Bye.
Bye.